So that movie, that clip comes from a very famous documentary that came out in 1972. The film is called Marjoe, and it won an Oscar for Best Documentary. It tells the story of child evangelist Marjoe Gortner. Gortner was raised by his parents, who were themselves itinerant Pentecostal preachers, to be an evangelist. Recognizing his talent at an early age, they actually trained him in all the tricks of the trade. They even used abuse and violence to make him learn all his lines. Using Mick Jagger as a model, they taught him how to use his body to woo and win over a crowd with music and preaching, to manipulate their emotions and squeeze worshipers for every dollar that they had on them. And audiences, they just showed up in droves to see this child prodigy who was supposedly touched by the Spirit of God. Now, eventually, as an adult, Marjoe had a crisis of conscience about what he was doing, and he invited a film crew to travel with his family during one of their many evangelistic crusades. While they whipped crowds into a charismatic frenzy, he gave interviews backstage admitting what a charlatan his parents were and what they did with all the money. Marjoe confessed that he didn't even really believe in God. Neither did his parents. They were just taking advantage of ignorant people. Soon after the movie's release, Marjoe's dad disappeared with millions of dollars, and Marjoe decided to try his hand at acting. He was an actor, after all. He starred in several B movies with Andy Griffith and some others, and appeared in such 1980s classics as The A-Team, Airwolf, and Fantasy Island. There have always been greedy, insincere preachers about. Jesus even warned his followers to watch out for them. In addition to compromising the gospel and stealing from naive worshipers, these greedy preachers, they might make life difficult for the rest of us. How many times have you visited a church and wondered if you can really trust the leadership there? How many visitors have there been to Rooftop who like the church, they like the worship, they like the people, but they're not sure what goes on in the back rooms? Sure, Pastor Matt, he's got the moves like Jagger. But does he believe what he's saying? Is he the real deal? I bring this up because it's a fair question. Christians should be able to trust their pastors and their leaders. They should be able to trust their integrity, their stewardship. But how do you know that you can? There's always been a Marjoe about. There always has been. In fact, even the Apostle Paul had to deal with this situation. In his first letter to the Thessalonians, he actually has to defend himself against accusations that he's nothing but a Marjoe. We started a new series on Paul's letters to the Thessalonians a couple weeks ago. The series is called More and More, and it's called that because this was Paul's prayer for his young church, that God would bless them more and more. Paul had started this young congregation in the midst of severe persecution, and even after he was run out of town, he kept up his relationship with this church through heartfelt letter writing. And we're studying these letters because Paul's prayer is actually a good one for us to pray, that God might bless us more and more as he wants to do. So last week, Jeremy discussed with us chapter 1, and this morning we're going to go ahead and study together chapter 2. Let me go ahead and read it to you, after which we will discuss it. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. We never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ we could have asserted our authority. No, instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil, our hardship, We work night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and into his glory. Now, when it comes to studying the Bible, it's really important to understand what genre of material you are reading. The Bible's filled with lots of different types of genres of material. And in order to study it, you kind of got to know what genre you're reading. If you're studying a poem, you got to study it as a poem. If you're studying a historical narrative, you got to study it as a historical narrative. And if you're reading a letter, you got to study it as a letter. This is a letter. Paul's writing a letter, an epistle to the church that he helped start. That means that there's a certain context that we have to keep in mind while reading this letter. What does that mean? Well, people write letters in response to situations. And it's important to understand the situation in order to understand the letter. It's hard to understand the situation by reading a letter, though, because you're actually only getting one side of the conversation. We don't have in our Bible the letter that the Thessalonians wrote to Paul, to which Paul responds with his letter to the Thessalonians. We just have Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. It's kind of like listening to someone else talk on the phone. You know, if you're listening to someone in the room talk on the phone, you can maybe kind of pick up what they're talking about, what the situation is, but you can't be too sure. It's like that old State Farm commercial, you know, when a wife catches her husband speaking in hushed tones late at night. You can do that for me? Oh, wow, that'd be great. The wife assumes that he's talking to some kind of phone prostitute. Really? He's talking to Jake from State Farm, who's given him a really great deal and is also wearing khakis. So you got to be careful when listening to one side of a conversation, not draw too many conclusions. Having said that, Paul actually gives us lots of information in this letter which describes the situation in Thessalonica. Plus, we actually learn about this church from the book of Acts. Remember, 2 weeks ago, we studied Luke's version of Paul's founding of this church in Acts. So Paul established this church when he preached the gospel in the city of Thessalonica, but according to Acts, he was just too successful. And the local leaders were very jealous of his success, so they ran him out of town. Based on our reading of Paul's letter, what seems to have happened is that even after Paul was forced out of town, the local leaders tried to come along and undo what Paul had done. How are they trying to do that? By calling Paul a Marjoe. By undermining his credibility, by accusing him of greed, by trying to persuade the new Christians that Paul wasn't worth following. It was all an act, and they should come home. That situation actually makes sense of what Paul says in this passage. You see, here in this passage, Paul offers a defense of his ministry to this young church. He defends himself as a messenger sent by God to them. He's not just some Marjoe traveling about. He's from God. But he's not defending himself for his own sake. I mean, Paul doesn't really care about his own reputation. He's defending himself so that this young church can have confidence that what has started in them is from God. And they can go with it. He's defending God's work in their midst as authentic, not his own. Now, how does Paul do this? Well, Paul defends the divine authenticity of his ministry in Thessalonica by clarifying his message, explaining his motives, and pointing out his manner. Yes, this morning's message is brought to you by my personal favorite letter of the English alphabet, the letter M. That's what's happening in this passage. Paul is defending the divine authenticity of his ministry in Thessalonica by clarifying his message, explaining his motives, and pointing out his manner. And this is what I want to talk to you about this morning. And the reason I think it's important to talk about these things is because I think it will help us understand, learn, whom we can trust. Like I said, you can't trust everybody. There's always a Marjoe about. But how do you know how to trust? How do you know you can trust me? Well, by considering our message, our motives, and our manner. But this isn't just important for us to discuss to know whom we can trust. It's also important for us to think about as we consider whether or not people can trust us. Because here's the thing. We're messengers of Christ too. People are wondering if they can trust us. How would we tell them that they can? How would we tell them that as Christians, we're not Marjoes? That we're the real deal? Because it's not just me that's got to be the real deal. You got to be the real deal. So let's go through these one by one. First, Paul defends the divine authenticity of his message by the divine authenticity of his ministry by clarifying his message. What was Paul's message to the Thessalonians? Well, this is easy. It was the gospel. As he writes in verse 2, we had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, but with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. And later he mentions this again in verse 4. We speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. And in verse 8, we were delighted to share with you the gospel of God. Now what's the gospel? Well, the gospel is the good news of Jesus Christ. The word gospel actually translates the Greek word euangelion, which means good news, good message. Eu is the Greek prefix for good. Angelion is the Greek message or word for message. It's where we get the word angel, message. That's what the gospel is. It's the good news that God so loved the world, that he came to earth as a man. Hopefully you know this. Came to earth as a man to show us how to live, die for our sins. He defeated the power of death by raising from the grave. He ascended into heaven, and he rules over all creation, from where he is coming again to judge the living and the dead. That's the gospel. That's the good news. That's the message that Paul came to preach. But notice how Paul describes this gospel. Twice, Paul describes the gospel as God's gospel. We were delighted to share with you the gospel of God, he says. This isn't Paul's message, it's God's. Basically, you can trust what's happening in your midst because it's not my word. It didn't start from me, it came from God. I mean, Paul's probably thinking, if I had a message to preach to you, it would probably be something else. I mean, think about it. Everywhere Paul went to preach the gospel, he got into trouble. He says here he was treated outrageously in Philippi. Outrageously. He was run out of town by the Thessalonians. He was abused in Corinth. He was arrested in Jerusalem. So yeah, the gospel is good news, but a lot of people didn't hear the gospel as good news. It actually made them pretty mad. They didn't like hearing about sin. They didn't like hearing about judgment. They didn't like hearing that they got to love their neighbors, turn the other cheek. They didn't like hearing about having to worship Jesus as king. This is Paul's point, though. You can trust that I'm speaking on behalf of God, because if I was speaking on my own behalf, I'd be speaking something else. I wouldn't be speaking things that get me into trouble all the time. I was thinking about the disciples this week, the first 12 followers of Jesus. Tradition actually tells us that at least 10 of these guys died as martyrs for their faith. They never broke, though. They never said it was a big conspiracy and that Jesus hadn't really raised from the dead. These guys went to their graves preaching that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. Now, people sincerely believe incorrect things all the time. I get that. But the fact that Jesus' disciples would go to their grave preaching that they saw Jesus rise from the dead is strong evidence suggesting that he actually did. And the fact that Paul would endure what he did to preach the gospel of God as commissioned by God, despite being treated outrageously, is strong evidence to suggest that he was actually sent by God. This is Paul's message, the gospel, and it was God's gospel that God had given him to preach no matter what happened, and not on his own. This is what he's clarifying. Secondly, Paul defends the authenticity of his ministry by explaining his motives. Why did Paul do what he did? The people trying to undermine his work accuse him of being kind of shady, being a little greedy, being a little bit of a Marjoe. So Paul feels the need to explain what were his motives. Well, first Paul explains what his motives were not, as he writes in verse 4. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. You know, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. Basically, God says, I swear to God that while we were with you, we didn't share the gospel to make money. We didn't share with you the gospel to get you to like us. We didn't show up in Thessalonica because we wanted to start a nice church where we could live comfortably by the seaside and count dollars in our hotel room. Why did we do this? We did this for a very simple reason. We did this to obey God. As he says in verse 4, we are not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ we could have asserted our authority. No, instead, we were like young children among you. We were like young children among you, Paul says. Now, what are children? Children are snotty. Children are poopy. Children are fussy. They don't always cooperate on stage. But also children are innocent. Our motives are innocent, Paul is saying. We had no ulterior motives. We came to Thessalonica only to please God. He told us to preach the gospel, and so we did. That's it. Now, why was this important for the Thessalonians to know? Well, we can imagine why. I mean, think about it. When we go to church, we're looking for certain things, right? We're sizing it up. It's been a long time since I've ever visited a church. I tend to be occupied on Sunday morning. But I've heard that when people are visiting churches, they are evaluating certain characteristics. They are looking for the visitor experience or the quality of the coffee or the music or the teaching. They're sizing it up. But if we're really looking under the hood, we want to know what motivates that church leadership. We want to know why they do what they do. If they're in it for themselves, for tradition, for money, for security, for acclaim, for comfort, we know that they can't really lead as God wants them to lead, and we probably don't want to be there. We know we can't trust them if they're in it for themselves in any way. Why not? Because if they're in it for themselves, they can't really obey God. And we need leaders who are obedient to God. We need leaders who want more than anything else to please God, not other people, not themselves. I'll confess to battling this, as many pastors do. You and I have talked about this before. This is a temptation of mine. I've met plenty of pastors over the years. And here's the thing about us. Pastors are very broken people. Lots of us go into ministry out of a sense of brokenness and need, sometimes even more so than a divine calling. I feel the same way about missionaries and counselors. Plenty of people go into Christian ministry not because God called them, but because serving God in this way makes them feel at least a little bit better about themselves. And the scary thing is that sometimes it works. If you find the right situation, you might be a pretty good pastor or a pretty good counselor or a pretty good missionary. You might get lots of attention, might get lots of approval, and you might mistake that success as proof of your divine calling. But success doesn't necessarily mean anything. Success doesn't mean you should be doing what you're doing. I've met successful pastors who should probably be doing something else. And in all candor, I'm constantly having to test my own motives here. I mean, Matt, are you doing this for you? Are you doing this for God? I mean, for an insecure, people-pleasing guy like myself, I know I am vulnerable to doing things for the wrong reasons. I mean, I grew up in life wanting my life to mean something. Behind all my hyperactivity and my childhood ambition, that's what I wanted. I wanted my life to mean something. I wanted to make my mark. And honestly, my lingering fear is that Rooftop Church is Matt Hernan's attempt to make his mark. That is not a good reason to start a church. So how do I test my motives? God helps me here. As Paul says, he tests my heart. Every time I fail, and I've failed many, many times, it forces me to reevaluate if I'm doing this to be a success or out of obedience. Every sermon that bombs reminds me that the word is God's, not mine. Every person that I disappoint proves to me again that no matter how hard I work, I cannot please everybody, and I cannot care. In fact, this is Paul's point. If I wanted to please people, I just can't be a pastor. I can't preach the gospel. If I wanted to please people, I couldn't talk about sin or holiness. I couldn't talk about judgment. I couldn't talk about Jesus being the only way that anybody gets to heaven. But that's not going to make people happy. If I want to make people happy, I need to be a juggler. Or I need to be a pastor in some church that doesn't talk about difficult things. But this isn't my message. It's not my church. And the only reason you should trust me or any spiritual leader or anybody in your life is if they have the courage to piss you off because they care more about what God thinks than what you do. The Thessalonians could trust Paul's ministry as divine because his message was from God. His motives were to please God and God alone, not them. And lastly, Paul defends the authenticity of his ministry by pointing out his manner. He clarifies his message, explains his motives, and points out his manner. Now, what was his manner? How did Paul do what he did? Well, this is actually my favorite part of the passage. Here's what Paul says in verse 8. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. But surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. Thing goes on. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believe. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God. There is a lot here, but Paul is describing how he pastored this little flock, and how was that? In all the ways. He didn't just preach at them, he did life with them. He didn't just share with them the message, he shared everything. He shared his time, he shared his heart. He didn't even demand compensation from them, even though it would have been within his apostolic rights. He worked on the side night and day to cover his needs so that nobody could accuse him of preaching the gospel for money. This is a first century picture of Paul making tents. That's what most people think Paul did at night. He made tents. And also he lived it out. He lived out the gospel. The Thessalonians witnessed his holiness and righteousness and integrity. They didn't hear him preach one way and then catch him in his hotel room canning money after the service. And he did it with compassion. Like a mother who loved her kids, like a father who encouraged his children, Paul loved and cared for those people as his spiritual offspring. This was his manner: compassion, integrity, diligence, generosity. You can trust those things, Paul says. It's kind of hard to fake those things, Paul says. In fact, this all reminds me of the most important pastor I've ever had in my life. His name was Joe. He was my pastor in college. I've told you about him before. He wasn't flashy. As a preacher, wasn't a strong leader or a brilliant theologian. In a lot of ways, he was average Joe. But Joe loved you. He spent hours listening to me pour out my problems to him at Taco Bell and had me over to his house for dinner and introduced me to his family. He shared himself with me, not just the gospel, but his life. That's how Joe made his mark. What I want to point out, though, is that when it comes to looking for spiritual leaders, these attributes, diligence, holiness, generosity, they're just not what a lot of us are looking for. Some of us are, but not all of us. I mean, if we're honest, what do we want in our leaders? We want our pastors, our leaders, to be brilliant theologians or TED-level speakers or gifted CEOs and have sterling resumes and beautiful families. We think that's how we would know that someone is touched by God. I was talking to a friend recently who was lamenting the fact that her pastor was leaving for another church, and she was very sad, understandably so, because he was such a great speaker, and he was so charismatic, and she said, God clearly had great plans for this young man. And I remember wondering, how would we know if God has great plans for somebody? Well, Paul says diligence, faithfulness, generosity, compassion, integrity. That's what makes people special, but that's not what we look for. And knowing this, it's not what a lot of pastors even train for anymore. They know they're not going to be evaluated like that. They're not going to get ahead like that. I mean, trust me, I've looked at a lot of pastor resumes over the past couple of years. We're trying to expand our staff, and just those things just don't appear. Education does, experience does, sermon samples are always prominently displayed. But nothing about integrity, nothing about holiness. That's how God works, though. I mean, I've preached a lot of sermons here at Rooftop, some of them even, passable. But God is my witness. The way that the Spirit has moved here over the years, the way that God has built this is by people sharing their lives together, pursuing the righteousness of Jesus together, loving one another over the long haul as a family and working at it. Day and night, working at it. In fact, if you're visiting us this morning, and if you're wondering if God's really here, that's how you can know that he is. It's not me, it's not the worship, not the teaching, not the marketing. It's people sharing their lives together and pursuing together over many years the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So that's Paul's manner: diligence, compassion, righteousness, integrity. There is an end result here, though, that I want to share with you before we close. Quick recap, though. So Paul's point here is to defend the divine authenticity of his ministry in Thessalonica. He wants them to last a long time, so he defends what God started among them. And he clarifies his message, he explains his motives, and he discusses his manner. What do all these things add up to? Well, you're going to hate me here. You're going to hate me here. But it all adds up to maximum impact. I told you were going to hate me. It adds up to maximum impact. But this makes sense. I mean, there's no I in impact, right? It's all God, right? There's no I. It's God's message. It's not I's message. Yeah, thank you. Let me tell you what I mean, though. So in verse 1 of this passage, Paul writes, "You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results." Our short visit, it was not without results. That's how Paul starts the passage. There were results. His point is that they can trust that God is in their midst because there was fruit, there was results, there was an impact. The results were from a God-centered message, a God-centered motive, and a God-centered manner. When our message, our motives, and our manner are centered on Jesus, good things happen. I mean, look around you. Good things are happening. Good things happen in churches where the message, the motives, and the manner are centered in Christ. That's when we can experience maximum impact. God. But this isn't just true in a church, right? This is true in our lives. It's true in yours. You might not be a pastor, you might not be a deacon, you might not be an elder, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a neighbor, maybe you're an office worker, maybe you're a lawyer, maybe you're a service employee. Whoever you are, though, you've got the message. It's not my message, it's yours. More specifically, it's not yours, it's God's, and he gave it to you. He gave you that message to share. This isn't just my job, it's all ours. And you've got to do that. You've got to share that message with the proper motives. You've got to share that message with your students, with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with your loved ones, remembering that you can't care what they think about you. Do you love them enough not to care what they think about you if you tell them about Jesus? But how are you going to do that? What's your manner? You don't got to be that articulate. You don't got to be that flashy. You don't got to be brilliant. That's not how God has sent the message of Christ into the world over the past 2,000 years and built the biggest, most growing organization in the human history. That's not how it happens. That's not even what people need. What they need to see you living it out. They need to see you sharing your life with them, living a life of diligence and integrity and generosity. So what's your message? What are your motives? What's your manner? Are you a Marjoe? Or are you a missionary living for maximum impact?